With NVIDIA's recent announcement of their 5000 series graphics cards, they also announced DLSS 4, which DLSS is their deep learning super sampling, and it's pretty much just a suite, depending on the version, it's a suite of enhancements to the game in general to improve FPS, without just making the graphics card better and rendering faster. It's a way to get around that using deep learning, or AI. So recently, people have been a little bit annoyed because of the DLSS 4, and we're going to get into why exactly that is with good old Paint here. You can always count on Paint. So DLSS is, as I said, trying to increase the FPS of your game without actually just making the graphics card faster, making it better, or rendering the game, optimizing the game traditionally. And there are two main parts to DLSS. There is the upscaling, and then there is the frame generation part of DLSS. And this frame generation part of DLSS is the main reason that people are a little bit upset with NVIDIA in their recent charts with the 5000 series performance uplifts, and also just in general the direction they're heading. This is the main reason people are upset, frame generation. We're going to get into why exactly that is. So first of all, upscaling. Let's say you have your monitor, oh, that's a perfect monitor, and it's rendering the game at 1080p. Nothing crazy, it's just rendering the game at 1080p, and you're getting about, for simplicity's sake, 100 FPS. Now, the upscaling side of DLSS is simply, instead of just rendering the game at 1080p, it's going to actually render the game at 720p, for example. There's different resolutions it'll render at, but it'll render it at 720p, and then it'll use AI to upscale the image back to 1080p. Now, there is a cost to upscaling. However, this cost is pretty much always less than the increase in FPS you get from rendering at 720p. So in this example, let's say at 720p, your GPU can actually get 150 FPS, but then it upscales it, so that takes a little bit of power, but not as much. So let's say it goes to 140 FPS. And this is what upscaling does. This is the process of upscaling. And because your GPU is involved in rendering every single frame, like in this, it'll just be smaller, in this example 720p instead of 1080p, because your GPU is still taking part in rendering every frame, there is no latency drop-off, and your latency goes down as your FPS goes up, just as if you were traditionally rendering it at 1080p and just up your FPS to, 140. The latency here is going to be the same as if you just had a more powerful graphics card and were able to get 140 without upscaling at 1080p. So upscaling, people generally like upscaling. It has its issues, but it's gotten pretty good recently, and especially with their DLSS 4 implementation of upscaling, it looks like it's gotten even better. So there are still some artifacts, and there's still issues even with this newer implementation, but it has a pretty wide use case, and there's a lot of games in which upscaling makes sense, because other than some slight visual artifacts, you're not having to give up anything else. It's pretty much just an increase to FPS, and your latency goes along with that. Now, frame generation is a little bit different, and that's where people have gotten angry recently. So, frame generation, instead of upscaling, there is your monitor, and the GPU, same scenario, renders the game at 1080p, like the original upscaling scenario. And frame generation takes this 1080p image and then waits a little bit longer for part of the next frame to generate. And then, once it has enough information from the next frame, it doesn't need all of it, but enough, it then guesses what the frame would look like in between these two fully rendered frames by your GPU. And this is frame generation that's in DLSS 3 currently. Now, it does have more drawbacks than upscaling does. And that's because since it has to wait on this second frame to start being generated, it's actually going to increase your latency at all times, no matter what. And in this case, assuming that there's no bottlenecks to the GPU and it has enough power to fully implement frame generation, it is doubling your FPS, but then your latency, how the game feels, and how long it takes to react to you, because your GPU isn't actually involved in this making this frame. The GPU can't change this frame depending on your inputs changing. So this frame is not reactive to your inputs. It's only these two frames that are actually generated by your GPU that can react to it. So your latency goes up a little bit because it has to wait slightly for part of this next frame to be generated. But your frame rate actually doubles what you see on screen. Now, once again, how it was with the upscaling, there are some artifacts, and this isn't perfect. And in general, the artifacts tend to be worse than on upscaling. And this is why people don't like frame gen as much. It can't really be used in competitive games, or never should be used in competitive games, no matter what. And it generally looks a little bit worse. And then your latency is going up. Some people get headaches or sickness. So the reason people are mad with DLSS 4 and NVIDIA at the recent 5000 series is because they are taking this frame generation and they're simply supercharging it. So instead of guessing what a frame in the middle of these two rendered would look like, it's actually doing the exact same thing, but the new super version of frame generation in DLSS 4, they still have the ×2, but they've added this ×4 version. This new version puts in, instead of 1 frame added after each generated frame, it's putting in 3 in between. And because of this, the latency goes up even further. So it has to wait for this next frame to generate a little bit by the GPU, and then it puts these 3 frames in the middle to try and smooth out the motion. But this takes more processing power than just putting 1 frame in. So the latency goes up, not a ton, but a little bit more than the X2 frame generation. So now you're getting 4 times the frames, but your latency is even higher. So this new multi-frame generation mode that's coming with DLSS 4 and is only available on the 5000 series graphics cards is the main reason people are a little upset with NVIDIA, because they're using this frame rate number, the 4x mode, and comparing it against the 2x mode on the older generation of cards, and simply showing in graphs FPS number, when in fact this 4 times FPS is not the same quality and not the same thing as if you simply, upscaled it. That would be a little bit better, not as much drawbacks. And then definitely it's not as good as if you just had the processing power to generate to render all 4 frames. So NVIDIA's taking 2 scenarios that are not apples to apples and comparing them, as in this you can see in these charts right here. They're using DLSS plus full ray tracing, and there's DLSS performance upscaler and DLSS ray reconstruction on both the 40 and 50 series. And then there's, as we just went through, 2 times frame generation on the 40 series, but they're using the new multi-frame generation on the 50 series whenever you see this DLSS, except for on Plague Tale, but that's because it's limited. So all of these 3 games, Cyberpunk, Alan Wake, Black Myth, Wukong, the 50 series is using the 4x frame generation mode, where the 40 series is only using the 2x frame generation mode. And as you go to the left a little bit, so Plague Tale Requiem, there's DLSS and RT as well. But if you look down here, it only supports 3, so this isn't able, at least we're assuming, to use the multi-frame generation mode. This is comparing just frame generation on 40 and frame generation on 50, the X2 mode. Now it's still using ray tracing, But the Far Cry 6 benchmark takes out DLSS completely, so there's no upscaling and no frame generation. There's just ray tracing. But this still isn't the pure raster performance increase. So I hope this video helped you understand a little bit more about upscaling frame generation, the differences between them, drawbacks, benefits, and why people are a little bit angry with NVIDIA recently.